story started with our son, my firstborn. He had chronic gastrointestinal issues. He projectile vomited. He developed sleep apnea, where he would have these strange motions. He would stop breathing, his arms would rise up, and then he'd startle and come back to breathing again, which was alarming as a new mother. And we got a sleep apnea pad so that alarm would sound when he stopped breathing for too long, when he was sleeping and we were trying to sleep. I spent many countless hours watching him through the baby monitor, and didn't even realize what we were injecting into our son, allowing the doctors to inject him, were causing all these issues. And I have been a speech pathologist and an autism specialist for many years. I started working with kids with severe to profound autism in the mid to late 90s. And at that time, the parents that I worked with, all of them that I was working with, the ones that had the severe to profound, that they were not able to even attend a educational program in the schools. All of their treatment was done in the home. These were the kids that were nonverbal. Their cases were just overwhelming to the children and to their families. And those parents said that vaccines had caused the regression in their child, and they were absolutely sure. And at that time, it was the MMR. And it was a growing trend in the 90s from parents that were screaming from the rooftops that their children were regressing after the MMR shot. And this was a time when it was okay to talk about vaccine injury. And this is when Jenny McCarthy came onto the scene and talked about her child regressing. And you would see her on the news and in talk shows talking about it. And parents at that time were concerned for good reason, because our autism rates starting in the early 80s were really 1 in 10,000 kids were diagnosed with autism. And most people didn't even know what autism was. And then in the late 90s, it had risen to 1 in 500. And then it was alarming. But as a parent, when I finally became a parent and had my first child, even though I've heard the testimonies of the parents of the children that I worked with, and I saw the devastation and the brain damage and their lives completely destroyed, I still wasn't ready to say I'm not going to vaccinate my own kids. I still was not ready to learn and research and do my due diligence. And I just wanted to believe that the doctors knew what was best. But I had some concerns, and so I went out and I bought a book, Dr. Sears' book on vaccine, the vaccine book. And I read that. I read about the vaccines and some of the ingredients that were in them, and chose a alternative vaccine schedule for my son, thinking, okay, well, at least I'm doing something and I'm minimizing the risk. And that's where I left it. And he followed that vaccine schedule, and he was sick. But of course, I never made the correlation between his vaccines and his sicknesses. And it wasn't until when he turned 2.5 and got his vaccines, and it took a few weeks, for me to see the dramatic neurological regression that had begun in my son. So as an autism specialist, I know those early signs of autism, and I can tell you my son was not autistic before the age of 2 and before he had those final shots. So he just, one day, he was playing with his toys, and I was noticing that he was lining up his cars, and that was alarming to me, as I have seen many kids lining up their toys. And I started to call his name, and he didn't respond. And I said it over and over again, and my son, who was social and charismatic and inquisitive and always engaging, was more interested in the toys he was lining up than his mother calling his name. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. But even then, when I saw my son was regressing, even then I could not make the correlation of the well visit that he had 3 weeks ago to this neurological regression. And it took me until what happened to his sister years later for me to realize and go back and look at his medical chart and look at his vaccine record and see that after every well check that he had a vaccination, within a week, some 2 weeks, but some within days or the next day, he was hospitalized or went back for a sick visit to his pediatrician. And boy, when I realized that, I discovered that when I finally had the guts to look back on the medical chart, it was more than a mother should ever have to bear. To know that I put my child in harm's way over and over and over again when he was showing signs of adverse vaccine reactions after every shot. That's a guilt and a regret I will have for the rest of my life. Then his sister came along, and we gave her shots at her 2-month shots, and we gave all the ones that the doctors recommended, not even thinking twice. I mean, at that point, I didn't even know my son was vaccine injured. I had another son after him, and life was busy. It's my 3rd child. I got my baby girl, and I just didn't do the research. And so she had her shots, her 2-month shots. And the next day, she developed a very high fever and started vomiting. And she was to the point she was vomiting bile, and she was hospitalized 2 days after those vaccines with an IV in her head. And me asking, could this be a vaccine reaction? And those doctors in the ER told me no, there's no correlation to vomiting, even though I know now that that is very much an adverse reaction, and the rotavirus vaccine can actually cause intesticession. But they don't know. The doctors don't know. They were like me. They don't do the research. They assume our regulatory agencies are doing the right thing and that the vaccines are safe and they're effective and they're important, and they're not trained to recognize vaccine injury. So after her vomiting, we took her home from the hospital, and 2 weeks later, she was back in the hospital undergoing EEGs. So I had noticed a week after that she started having these peculiar motions when she was falling asleep and when she was waking up. When I was nursing her, she kept doing like these crunches, like little baby crunches. And I started to find it alarming because they were happening in more of a repetitive pattern. And I started videotaping them, and finally got the attention of a neurologist, because even her pediatrician with the videos couldn't even recognize what these seizures were. She didn't recognize that these were seizures, and refused to even refer her to a neurologist or to get a workup. And thankfully, because of my son with autism, had already established care with the neurologist and was familiar with seizure activity, and very amazingly, he was a specialist in this kind of seizure. I sent him the video, and he that night admitted my daughter into the hospital in Detroit and underwent EEGs. So we found out that Catherine had developed benign infantile spasms, and we're grateful for the benign part, because many kids, it is not benign, and it causes massive brain damage. And so I'm just grateful that that didn't happen to Catherine. And we set her up with a neurologist in town in Grand Rapids, so that we could have them monitor her. And at that time, again, nobody said anything that the vaccines that she got could have caused this problem. But her neurologist did say that infantile spasms can be caused or exacerbated by the DTaP. But he never mentioned to me that it was the DTaP that could have actually caused those. And it took me a couple of years to actually read the vaccine insert of the DTaP vaccine to realize that that vaccine is what caused my daughter's neurological spasms. But it did he gave me enough information for me to feel that we shouldn't be doing the DTaP, and we need to postpone vaccines and delay vaccines. In the interim, she developed 7 different food allergies. She was sick. All the time, like her entire childhood. And she developed a circular rash, an annular rash they call it, on her torso. And we went to several dermatologists, pediatric dermatologists all over, and trying to get this rash under control, and no medication and no cream helped the rash. And finally we just gave up. After a year of trying to resolve the rash that had spread across her torso, we just gave up, and we said, we're gonna stop giving her all these steroid creams and medicines because nothing's helping. So that was her. She just had this rash on her, and she had these spasms. And then at 4, her spasms had faded, and we no longer were seeing them, and her rash was still there. And the pediatrician had told us that for our daughter to go to school when she was 5, she was going to need to have all of her vaccines, and that it was time to start catching her up so we didn't have to give it to her all at once. And so I reluctantly did, but I said, let's not do the DTaP because the neurologist said that those can make her spasms worse, and certainly don't want to cause any more neurological damage. And I trusted the doctor to do what was right for her. And so we caught her up on some of her shots, a lot of shots, and went home 3 days later, and she got a fever, of course, but 3 days later, she developed severe facial tics where her eyes would blink and her face would scrunch literally every second. And I called her doctor in a panic and I said, my daughter is ticking. My daughter is ticking. Her whole face is ticking. And the doctor, I hear the doctor talking to the nurse on the phone. I hear the doctor next to her, and he said, why not tell her that it has nothing to do with the ingredients of the vaccine. Tell her that it was probably the stress of the pokes, of the needles, that were causing the tics. And he was so convinced of this that he tells her, tell her I have an opening this afternoon. She can come in and she can catch up the rest of her vaccines since she's ticking anyway. Okay, no joke. He said that. And the nurse repeated that to me. To my astonishment, I couldn't believe it. I said, can you repeat that again? You want me to bring my daughter, who is having a neurological reaction to the vaccine she just got 3 days ago, and you want me to bring her back to have more vaccines, and that there's no way that what we just injected into her was causing this neurological problem? It was so beyond belief that it was the moment that I realized the only one that my daughter can rely on is me to do the research and figure out what has gone wrong and how do I help her. And that's where I started to learn the horrific truth of what has really gone wrong in our vaccine program here in the United States, how our regulatory agencies are captured, how there's no safety studies that are done for the childhood pediatric schedule, and how there's no long-term monitoring or tracking or training on vaccine adverse reactions. Like, my whole world just turned upside down. So, Catherine, her story didn't end there. So the rash that was on her torso, which we had never figured out, we finally got answers to when we were down in the South Pacific, the Caribbean, and she developed a severe facial rash from being in the sun, to the point where she was scarred. And that sent us on a journey to realize that she developed an allergy to the sun and cutaneous lupus, and that the rash was all part of an autoimmune response from the vaccines that she had received when she was 2 months old, and probably exacerbated again when she was 4. So now my daughter has a lifelong autoimmune disease, and she has to be on medications. She has to be followed by dermatology, nephrology, because she leaks protein from her kidneys, and lupus can attack your kidneys and other organs. She has a neurologist, and then of course she has the rheumatologist. And it just breaks my heart that my daughter can't have a normal life and a normal childhood she has to endure medical treatments and testing and screenings. And it's just torturous for a child when all I wanted to do was protect her from the diseases. And in fact, I gave her one. So that's our story. I hope it helps other parents to do the research before they harm their children.
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. When the silence isn't quiet and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe, and I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Move mountains, bring it to its feet. Move mountains, and I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. We have each other, and for that we have each other, and we will rise, we will rise, we will rise. Oh, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times again.